With logistics covered, I'm really pleased to hand over to Councillor Phil North, leader of Test Valley Council. He's going to offer some initial reflections and framing to start today's conversation. Phil.
Thanks, Dawn, and welcome everyone. And I think you've said it there in terms of Test Valley's been on a journey over the last decade plus, shaping our own approach to neighbourhood governance through our community councillor model. 19 years ago, when I was first elected, I was quite frustrated because a lot of the resources were pointing towards the leader and the cabinet, to the detriment of non-exec members who found it really difficult to meaningfully contribute to anything or get anything done in the council. But since then, myself and my chief executive, Andy Ferrier, who's a member of the panel in a short while, and who was corporate director at the time, have been on a bit of a shared journey to create the communities team in Test Valley, where every councillor, regardless of political party or seniority, are viewed as community leaders in their own wards, and they are given the resources to do the job, not just financially, but through officer time too. And this has really transformed the culture in Test Valley, where there is now more of a cross-party working and less political bun fights for resources. And our approach and culture in Test Valley has grown over the years from there, and we really embrace place-based working, not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we have different approaches in Andover that we have in Romsey and our rural areas, for example. We developed a confidence in using citizens' assemblies, really getting under the skin of issues and listening to all perspectives, not just responding to those that shout the loudest. And we've also used that place-based working to build relationships and networks that have become really strong over the years. And I think some of our speakers later will give various examples of that. And also working in a preventative way and leaving organisational baggage at the door. And I think our success is underlined, actually, this is very timely, because we have a motion coming to our full council meeting this evening from opposition councillors about how we ensure that this culture that we have developed in Test Valley lives on in the new unitary authorities. And I have to say that's one of the things that does worry me the most. And despite our success, it can sometimes feel quite fragile, because most of it has been developed by behaviours rather than structures. And I hope that today we can explore ways in which we can try and embed this way of working into as many organisations as councils as possible, using the findings of the our joint report, Dawn, as you mentioned earlier. So I will end that there as a bit of a brief introduction of our journey so far, and I'm sure that that will get explored more in a moment as the panel gets stuck into the issues, and I'm also happy to contribute in the chat. So back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. I think, yeah, it's really a testament to how embedded and valued your approach is when it's the opposition bringing the motion to sustain this way of working through LGR. So thank you so much for that intro. To give everyone a sense of the agenda for today, so we'll be asking you to share some of your thoughts in a moment, so we know who's in the room. I'll then pass to my colleague Ellen Kerr, who'll share some headlines from the report that Phil and I have referred to. We'll have a panel discussion with Test Valley colleagues and a Q&A. And then we'll move to a panel discussion to share reflections from other local places and national policy perspectives. Give everyone a chance to check out and share some reflections and takeaways, and finishing at 3:30. So got an action-packed agenda, and Grace, I'll hand over to you now to get everyone sharing to see who's in the room.
Thanks, Dawn. So yeah, as Dawn mentioned in her intro, it's kind of the spread of people that we have in the room today is something that we think is really important. So before we kind of get started hearing from some of our speakers, we'd really love just to kind of get a sense of who's in the room with us today. And we've got a couple of quick Slido questions. So I'm just going to share my screen now. And yeah, so it would be great if you could join the Slido. If you haven't used it before, you can either scan the QR code using your phone, or you can kind of go to slido.com on either your phone or your computer and just enter the code that it shows on the screen there. And yeah, it would be great to hear kind of what city or town people are joining us from. And I'll give you a minute to answer that. Oh, Sheffield's and Leeds are growing. Yeah, it's great to see that we've got a real kind of mix of people joining us from all over the country and beyond the country as well. A minute or two more, and then we'll move on to our next question. Okay. We also just wanted to hear about what sector you're working in and representing today. And if your response is other, do let us know in the Teams chat where you're joining from. It would be great to kind of know a bit more about what sector you're joining from. Lots of people from local government and from the voluntary community and social enterprise sector. Lots of others. So yeah, do let us know where you're joining from. Amazing. Thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to hand over to Ellen, who led on our recent report, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Dawn. Hi, everybody. So I am a head of practice at Collaborate, and I was a kind of lead on the team for the report that we produced with Test Valley, which we published back in May. And it was a really great opportunity to get out and talk to lots of different people, lots of different perspectives in the borough about their experience of neighbourhood governance, although interestingly, very few people actually refer to it as neighbourhood governance. They talk much more about working in the community, working in place, and how it was really embedded in a way of working. To us, the practice in Test Valley is really significant and nationally significant because of the extent to which they've embedded relational place-based working into the day-to-day operations of the council, and the real synergy of vision and practice, not just among officers, but with councillors and also with partners and across the place. And neighbourhood governance feels like it's at the heart of this, but as I say, interestingly, it's not necessarily the language that people use to describe what they're doing. We heard a lot more about this idea of relationships and place-based working and community engagement and community working. And also a sense that this isn't driven by kind of structures or about particular models being applied across the place, but about this ecosystem approach. So that led us to kind of define neighbourhood governance not as a single model or organisational structure, but an ecosystem of relationships, partnerships, community assets and democratic forums operating at different scales, from small neighbourhoods right up to the county council, and the many different ways that the council officers, council members and partners were interwoven into that was really interesting to kind of try and pull that apart and look at that. As Phil referred to in his introduction, this is something that Test Valley has been doing and working on for a really long time. It's really embedded in their approach, and it's really grown and evolved over time. And we started in the report trying to kind of map out some of the key milestones all the way back to 2011 in this way of working, starting with a piece of work with the LGA through the establishment of that community councillor model that Phil referred to, the establishment of the community engagement team and bringing that resource and support together, all the way into thinking about different ways of using funding and different partnerships and groups that were set up in response to different places in Test Valley. And what was interesting about observing how this kind of story unfolded was first how much kind of iteration and evolution there had been along the way, that there wasn't a kind of defined plan set out at the start that we were kind of implementing and following, but that it was about kind of starting with what was happening in communities and building from there. And so it looked different in different places. As Phil said, that kind of place-based working part. Test Valley is one of those places that kind of isn't a place. No one wakes up in the morning and says, oh yeah, I'm from Test Valley, this is where I live. They live in Andover, or they live in Romsey, or they live in one of the villages. And those are the places that they identify with. So perhaps by necessity, the council can't just come in and say, this is how we do neighbourhood governance in Test Valley, come to the Test Valley Neighbourhood Forum, because maybe no one would come, because that's not the thing that they recognise. So recognising the different kind of identities of different places and starting from there, and seeing how those different approaches have grown was really interesting. But also to kind of see how deep that work went and how experimental it was with things like citizens' assemblies, with new ways of doing master planning or new ways of doing the corporate plan, so that these processes weren't just kind of one-offs that happened, but they were really embedded in the way that the council does its work. And what we noticed across these, as I say, was that this wasn't really about having individual structures or models. Structures matter, they are there, they're a part of how things happen, but they're not the driving force for what happens, and they're not the starting point for determining how something happens. Instead, across these kind of very different case studies that we looked at in depth, we saw that there was something in common, although they were happening in different localities with different starting points and different kind of journeys of how they evolved. Something they had in common was that they were taking this kind of holistic approach where the kind of foundation stone seemed to be the relationships, the culture, the ways of working, rather than kind of structures and tools. And we were able to kind of see emerging across these different case studies a kind of pattern of enabling conditions that were making this way of working possible. And we think these conditions are applicable to places much more widely than just Test Valley. Our sense is that in terms of building effective neighbourhood governance, effective place-based working, public service reform, these kinds of enabling conditions we see come up time and time again. But it was really interesting to see how they kind of emerged from the case studies that we looked at. And in the report, we give details of the case study and how each of these conditions presented in each of those different places. But I thought I'd just walk through kind of some of those conditions as a sort of framing to our discussion overall. So we've organised these as that kind of iceberg type model using FSG's water of systems change to kind of name our different layers. So if we start at the bottom, the idea of those kind of mental models, really influential foundational beliefs. So kind of a fundamental belief that communities are partners in shaping place. They're not just passive recipients of service. They're not people who you do things to. They're people who you do things with and alongside. And with that, a shared story of place, the shared sense of the place that we're working to. If we want people to be really actively involved in places where they live, we have to be working at a scale that they recognise, that means something to them, that they can identify with. On the next layer, we thought about relationships and connections and power dynamics, really important. So, for example, things like the commitment to equity and inclusion, that in doing this work, it's so important that we're really actively seeking to reach beyond established voices, the people who might come to the forums that exist already, but how do we get beyond that and engage a more diverse range of perspectives? How do we think about the kind of style of leadership that this kind of work takes, where the council has a really unique role and set of responsibilities? It has a democratic mandate, people are democratically elected to make certain decisions, but how does that kind of power sit along other kinds of community power, community legitimacy, and those things work together? We're going to talk, I'm sure, a bit more about the kind of cross-party approach that Test Valley have been able to use so successfully. So kind of putting that community benefit over political point scoring, and then really investing in relationships. And it's so easy to say that relationships matter in this work, but that kind of sense of really the consistency, the patience, the commitment it takes to make those relationships work, to learn together, to have the continuity of people sticking with it, having skin in the game, but also allowing for renewal as new voices come in and context change being really important. And then finally, in that top layer, we saw the importance of developing collaborative, open, participative cultures within organisations and across partners, and in how they work together. Having really well-functioning, well-facilitated networks and spaces for relationships to be nurtured, for people to come together. those tools like participatory decision making that complement representative democracy rather than being a kind of either or choice that we have to make. So residents are part of deliberation and decision making, not just kind of consulted on things. And finally, investing in people and skills and resources so that communities can act on their local priorities. And our sense is that these conditions are really present in Test Valley, and what that means is that the kind of prize of this is thriving, vibrant communities. For people, it means places where they're connected to their neighbours, they've got places to go to mix and mingle, services that meet their needs, a sense of belonging, their voice is respected, they're treated as kind of active shapers of their communities, not just these kind of passive recipients. And for the council, it's reducing isolation, it's preventing and delaying the need for service intervention, it's helping to move forward with confidence in multi-million-pound regeneration schemes that have the backing of the communities that they're working in, a really active civil society, engaged volunteers, and kind of really practical ways to resist some of the kind of negative divisive forces, the cynicism and distrust that kind of is so prevalent today. You know, a lot of the people that I spoke to in Test Valley, were very optimistic, they were hopeful, they were encouraging about their place, about their council, about how things were working together, and that was a real kind of quiet radicalism to what was happening that was really powerful to see. So what's been really interesting, and we'll hear more in the panel about how Test Valley have grown this approach, we wanted to kind of point out the ways and the starting points for this in places where perhaps you haven't had a 10-15 year run up at this, or new organisations that are just starting to form through LGR. How do we take this stuff forward? So codifying some practical steps to make this happen, and then a starting point was another kind of really important part of this piece of work, and that's set out there in the report too. So in a second, I'm going to take us into our panel discussion with our folks from Test Valley. But before that, we've got a bit of a video, hopefully, of some other voices and perspectives from Test Valley that you're going to hear a bit here from a range of people in different parts of the kind of local system who've been part of the ecosystem approach. Simon Bryant, Director of Public Health at Hampshire County Council, talks about why a place-based approach is really important. Some of the community members who've been directly involved in this work, so Jenny and Sue, talking about some of the different examples from running community shops to being trained as community researchers and conducting their own research in communities. And then Councillor Neil Gwynn sharing his perspective on the community councillor model and what that's looked like in practice for him, and how in fact that is what brought him into local government. So Rewa, if we could roll the film, please.
Hi, I'm Simon Bryant, the Director of Public Health for Hampshire. Partnership working is absolutely essential for public health because we know so many factors influence on people's health. Good public health means that we focus on everybody so they can all improve their health. We know that some people find it harder, so how do we think about those communities where improving health may be not their focus, and working together? So the future really brings an opportunity to work with our communities, understand their needs, understand what they would like to see to help them have healthier lives. Place is really important. People live in places, that's where they live their lives. If we can make those places where they can empower health, so thinking about the streets we live in, the roads we walk and cycle down, that's going to really improve the health of the population. We've seen other programs such as dementia-friendly settings where we can encourage shops and others to be more focused on things like dementia, and then also our houses and how we make those homes for life.
I'm Jenny Bannister, and I got involved with the Community Researcher project, which is run by the university and Test Valley Council, and I did a community research project about village resilience. What's achieved these things has been definitely been good relationships with the council. There's been lots of staff at the council that have been really helpful, very approachable, really approachable, and always, you know, willing to chat and say, right, yeah, let's have a time. If you've got any questions, you know, we can talk about this. And they're very engaging. So that's been really helpful, and I think people from the community being willing to come as well and attend these meetings and have that back and forth and that engagement and that discussion with the council, because you need, in my opinion, you need both elements.
My name's Sue Dawkins, and I am the manager of the community shop in the village. I'm also on the village hall committee, keeping our village hall going and keeping it going for the community. So we've had the community hub, that was fantastic. We also got picnic benches, again for the community. It's a lovely, safe, secure space. From then on, we've just produced, this is Janet's garden. This is probably one of the nicest things that I think, they're all good projects, but this is lovely. There's a solar grant for solar panels, which is fantastic. And my latest project is automatic opening, which I've just got a councillor grant for. So I've worked with Alison Johnson's been fantastic and supported. So when we have the art exhibition in the summer, open the windows and it's comfortable. If you haven't got that relationship with the community engagement team, that you don't know what's out there. And they can say, well, what about background? What about this one? What about climate? What about this? And they tell you about them all. And then you can go away and you can look at them and then think that would fit that bill. Or if they don't, they can say, well, actually, look at this one, look at this grant. But without that support and that knowledge, you don't know what's out there. But once you start finding what's out there, look what you can do. It's just amazing.
Hi, I'm Councillor Neil Quinn, leader of the Lib Dem opposition for a number of years now and a councillor since 2019. If it weren't for the community councillor model, I wouldn't be a councillor. So we're sat on the stage that I first stood on in 2002 and I'm now in my 13th year as chair of the theatre. And it was in that role that I was approached by Andy Ferrier to join Romsey Future, which was set up as part of the community councillor model to provide a channel between the community and Test Valley Borough Council. If it hadn't been for that approach and for my initial time on Romsey Future, I'd never have become a councillor in the first place. One challenge straight off is that I'm called leader of the opposition, and inevitably that means at times the role is to be the opposition, not to collaborate. And at other times, in line with the community councillor model, collaboration is the right thing to do, even if it's not 100% what you would prefer to do as Liberal Democrats. Getting that balance right is really on an issue by issue basis. But I think what community councillor model does is it poses the question every time for every issue, what's more important here? Party politics or collaboration for the benefit of the residents? And it's not always one or the other. Both of those are sometimes the right answer. And I think without the community councillor model, there's a danger of it just being about party politics.
Thank you, and thanks to Jack from Test Valley for capturing those videos for us and putting that all together. So yeah, we've heard some highlights, some examples there, but I'm really pleased now to welcome our panel from Test Valley to share more about their experience and some of the practical examples for how they've embedded this way of working and what it looks and feels like in practice. So really delighted to be joined by Andy Ferrier, Chief Executive, Councillor Stuart McDonald, who's a cabinet member and also the delivery lead for community-led projects, Imi Coley, community engagement manager, and Dr. Kate Elliott from the Andover Primary Care Network, who's been a really key partner in the Andover Health Hub, a real kind of jewel in what's come out of some of this place-based working in Andover. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's really lovely to have you here. I guess I wanted to start by asking you, perhaps by kind of an opportunity to introduce yourselves and the part of the kind of world that you see in relation to this. But I suppose the question of impact, what do you think is the impact that you've seen from Test Valley's approach to place-based working from where you stand? What is the change that it's made and what are you particularly proud of seeing that it's produced? Maybe Imi, should we start with you?
Hi, thank you. My name's Imi. I'm one of the community engagement managers at Test Valley. I think for me, the impact that really sticks with me the most is that change that I've seen between the way that people interact with local government. I think sometimes it can come with a bit of baggage or a certain perspective of how local government works, but actually what I've seen in practice is that it's really helped us reach people we might not traditionally engage with through like a formal process. it's enabled conversations to happen through some really trusted relationships and in places and spaces that people already know and already are comfortable with. And that co-design has led to some amazing sustainable projects being delivered. So I think it's just that it's that people first approach that I've seen have the biggest impact.
Great, thank you, Imi. And Kate, shall we come to you? Do you want to introduce yourself, tell us about your part of the world and how it fits into this and what the impact's been for you?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here as a 2% of the healthcare force. So lovely to meet you all in different spheres. So yeah, I'm Kate Elliott. I'm a GP in Andover. We've got 5 GP surgeries, and I am one of the clinical directors for Andover Primary Care Network. So that represents the 5 GP surgeries that cover the Andover area. I think reflecting on what the impact has been is I guess there's a couple of things that really stick out to me, has been around relationships at organisational level, and recognising the benefits that we've seen from the council adopting an approach which is about putting residents first, and that's one element. And then the engagement with the community has been key, and the council has been pivotal in leading on that. And have helped us with our health approach in having a focus on health. So thinking particularly about the Andover Deliberative Engagement Project, looking at health and wellbeing over the next 10 years, it's given us a real roadmap and a mandate to deliver services according to what residents are asking for. That's really powerful, both within the immediate organisation that I work with. When I go to my 5 surgeries, they're all independent businesses. I have to get them on board and engage with doing something. But when we've got the power of the voice of the community saying this is what they want, it's difficult to ignore that. And it also gives us power when we're looking at collaboration with wider partners to say, this is what our community needs, this is what they're asking for, can you help us to deliver that? So I think that's where value is really powerful in changing the way that we might structure services and what we deliver.
Thanks, Kate. Stuart, how about for you?
Afternoon. So my name is Councillor Stuart MacDonald. I'm one of the councillors for the Mid-Test ward. That covers a huge part of the area in the rural communities between Andover in the north and Romsey in the south. I was first elected in May 2023, and as you said, I was appointed to the cabinet in 25. And my role is primarily around community-led projects, and this is completely new to me. My background is in the commercial sector, so it's been fascinating. I think the key thing which would strike me is that certainly in all of our community work, what we're really trying to do is capture the power of volunteers, and that can be so powerful. And our role is really to enable those volunteers to deliver on those community projects, because you could adopt a very dictatorial approach and say this is the way to do things, but actually from what I've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, the power of those volunteers is just so significant. They know their communities way better than we sometimes do, and so they can get it absolutely right in a way that we might not always.
Thanks, Stuart. There's a lovely parallel there to what Kate was saying. There's, being able to respond to what people say they need when it's on, us as services to do something, but also empowering them, enabling them to do the things that they can do better sometimes than services are able to. Andy, do you want to introduce yourselves and I suppose as kind of overseer of some of this, what do you see as the impacts?
Overseer, that sounds quite threatening, doesn't it? I'm Andy Ferrier, the Chief Executive of Test Valley, and I'm really proud to work with what are a really inspirational group of people from across the area and beyond, in that this isn't just a council thing. In fact, it's not a council thing, it's a thing that's been driven by many people from across our communities. So the partnership is being one of the key things. And I guess that some of the conditions in terms of the impact for me are about the fact that it's created more confidence in people in certain roles. And I'd particularly highlight the councillors, and I've worked across the country and I've seen behaviours of all sorts of different types from elected members. But I think what's happened in Test Valley is that there's been a little bit of an evolution of the councillor. And if you see that T-shirt from time to time, don't you? The evolution of man and woman, where they start small and hunched up and then they become large at the end of it. And it feels like we've moved from a position maybe 15 years, 10 years ago, where people would be elected and they would say, I'm elected, I know therefore what I need to do. And that the council, the machine, would be peppered with people saying, I want to do this, I want to do that. And I think our model has just evolved that really to a place where our councillors, I think, play the role of convener of place. They've won the right to do that by being elected, but they're not seeking to impose their personal will anymore. And I wrote a piece recently for Robin Tuddenham at Solace about equity. I think what our councillors are bringing is equity to the system. They're bringing that sense that they're there to represent whole communities, not those who just shout the loudest. And as a result of that, I think that we've been able to deliver on things. A whole range of tools have allowed us to do that, deliberative democracy. But I think you mentioned it, Ellen, in your introduction, that connection between participative democracy and representative democracy. It's a powerful force when you bring them together, and it's a particularly powerful force if people are looking to invest in your communities. And when we were, for example, successful in a levelling up bid for one of our communities for a theatre, it was obvious that the government gave us that money because they were confident, one, in our deliverability abilities, but they were also confident that community that had been engaged and had driven the process were fully behind the projects that were involved in that regeneration scheme. So it's been a cultural change, particularly for councillors, but at the same time, it's not just what I'm accused of sometimes as being a soft and woolly thing that makes everybody feel nice. It has a sharp delivery end to it as well when it comes to real things on the ground. Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks, Andy. And maybe we'll stick with you to what we're really interested to do is kind of understand from those culture, that conditions, what does it take in practice to kind of build those conditions to do that? What does that look like? And if we stick with that idea of kind of culture, what are some of the things that you've done practically to build a culture, to build that confidence to behave in those different ways? Can you give us some examples of things over the years that feel like they've made a difference?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting culture, isn't it? Because again, it's one of those things that people often talk to us about as being the soft and woolly thing. And it's just a shame we don't get on with focusing on the day job. And if I had a pound for every time somebody spoke to me about the day job, I'd be very rich. And obviously, it won't surprise you that I think that everybody's day job is delivering for communities. And that's where I sometimes have parted in terms of my philosophical view from colleagues. But just think about culture. And I mean, it's interesting, in the last few weeks, we've had the crisis, haven't we, in maternity care in Nottingham, which has been tragic. But when you look at the reports that were written around that, some of that is definitely culture, isn't it? It's culture that's driven a tragic outcome in the case of the Nottingham hospital situation. And I read in the report that they spoke about this thing called the Nottingham Way. And again, I've worked in councils like that, where they talk about the X, Y, and Z council way, and they talk about it with pride. But for me, that is creating the conditions for inertia. It doesn't create the conditions for innovation and change. So I guess for people in the room who are maybe interested in organisational culture in particular, I think that one of the major things we've done is we've set ourselves on a very outward facing journey. And it's a little bit like listing off your favourite bands. You know, when I list off some of my favourite councils and organisations across the country, you know, I'm thinking particularly, I think about the Wigans, your Leeds, your Brents, your Camdens, your Oxfords, your Sheffields and your Dorsets, and you're probably thinking, well, what's the connection with all of those places? And what I would say, it's great systems leadership. It's people who are different sorts of leaders from the old days. They're not hierarchical in their approaches anymore. They place communities at the centre of that. But I think they've also recognised that you need to think about the place that that organisation plays in the community context. So our journey has been one very outward looking, and we've always sought help and assistance. And again, you know, we're here today with our collaborator colleagues who have played a fabulous part in our journey over a number of years now. You worked with us for a year a while back to help us understand what our values and what our behaviours should look like if we were really to move to being a place-based organisation. And that stuff helps articulate it to people that you work with. And again, there's so many people have been on that journey with us: New Local, the Leadership Centre, the LGA, Inland of Solace, a whole range of voluntary organisations. Each one of them coming in to challenge us in terms of the way we work. And I just saw the hierarchy thing pop up in the chat. And I guess that, you know, the thing about local authority culture is that it's often driven by the fact that a number of our colleagues have been taken through professional routes as part of their development, therefore putting them into silos. They get to the top of their particular professional pile and they become a leader in our system. And some of their behaviours are not conducive to asset-based community development. They're not systems leadership behaviours. They're all about control. They're all about that kind of public servant solving your problem for you. And our journey has been, I'd say, working with people like you to turn it on its head, to understand what it is we can do to convene, what we can do to assist. But more importantly, what does that behaviour look like in communities? If I go in there with a traditional mindset, bearing in mind that I am merely in that place as an alongside, as Cormac Russ would call it, I could really unpick a lot of the good work that's been done. So a lot of it has been around a long-term journey to how we behave, how we conduct ourselves, and what are our values.
Thanks, Andy. And I think I really got a sense of seeing that in practice in talking to teams. And I think what's interesting in Test Valley is you have people like Imi who the day job is the community engagement. They're really embedded in part of that. But it's not just been about having a team that does this. It's about everyone having that confidence, that willingness to talk to residents, to engage in conversation, to be a face of the council, to be able to have conversations and kind of lead from where they stand in the system. Imi, I'd be interested in kind of your perspective, that idea of kind of being out in the system, but also this kind of sense of working with what is already there. That seems to be a really strong kind of principle in how your team and how you encourage others in the council to work with communities. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
I'd love to, thank you. I actually wanted to touch on a couple of practical examples that I think really bring that to life really nicely. And the first one I wanted to pick up on was Sue in the video that we just watched. I think on the face of it, you look at Sue and she's talking about all the funding and the things they want to do, and oh, you know, it's a lovely village shop, isn't that brilliant that they're so engaged? But actually, I think what we do as a team and as an organisation is we look much closer than that and see that it's an asset and it's owned and operated by local residents. It's a community venture that relies on this team of volunteers, as Stuart was saying earlier, and it's a space that provides practical services, but it's also a social hub where relationships are built and conversations are had out in the open. And so it's about taking that step further from engagement into really understanding, it goes back to that ecosystem word, what makes up a place. Continuing that Broughton example, it's about the shop itself is working alongside the parish council, the church, all these other kinds of local initiatives that are part of that fabric of the village and that place. They're not separate organisations competing, but they are recognising they're the infrastructure of that community life, and so we work collaboratively with them to deliver those best possible outcomes for that community. And I think when I think about the practical kind of enablers of that, we wouldn't approach engaging with Broughton by putting in our own kind of process or structure on them. We'd really, listen and be curious to really understand what's going on there, because they're the ones with the trust from the residents. They're the ones that understand the need of that place. And I think for me, that's, and when we think about anchoring governance in places people recognise, it's about us entering their world and not asking them to enter ours. And I think that's something we always try and have right at the front of our kind of thoughts when we approach any engagement. And then the other example I just wanted to mention briefly as well is Andover Vision, which is a partnership in Andover, which is one of our towns with a really diverse population. And that partnership brings together residents, businesses, community groups, councillors, public services around this kind of shared aspirational vision for the town. And I think it's that networked approach where Andover Vision isn't replacing an organisation, but it's actually creating connections between them. It's bringing those different voices, different sectors, different communities together around a set of shared ambitions that everyone feels invested in. So I think for Andover, it wasn't about building like a formal structure, but actually creating space where those existing strengths, back to that asset-based approach, where those existing strengths and ideas can really come to the forefront. And a really practical example of that is we had a group emerge from Andover Vision. There was this aspiration around wanting to do more to celebrate the diversity of the town. And so through the vision, a group called the Cultural Sharing Forum has emerged, really built off the back of relationships between engagement officers, the local community, really understanding and hearing their hopes and ambitions for the town. And they've grown into this amazing group that put on events and celebrations and really do shine a light on that diversity and celebrate it. But I think the key where we take it that step further is because they're connected to the vision, they're now also in the room when we're talking about, you know, projects, you talk about the regeneration, that they now have a voice in that space. They're able to be part of that space, and potentially we're an underrepresented group previously. So it's all about that kind of two-way relationship for me. And I think the kind of core bit that always sticks with me is that we don't need to manufacture community. It's there. It's how we listen and how we understand and how we give it the resources it needs to kind of take things forward.
I think that's a lovely lovely idea of me, that, you know, kind of if you can't see community, you're looking in the wrong place. You're looking for the wrong thing, because it will be there somewhere, and if no one's showing up to your community things, then something's gone wrong. It's not that it doesn't exist. The Andover Vision's one of the case studies in the report, and I think it's really interesting how that has kind of changed and evolved over time, and the ownership of that has really kind of spread out across so many different places and people, but connected them into lots of different things. They, you know, they may have come for one thing and been drawn into so much more, and I think that's really interesting. Stuart, I was going to come to you next. I think that relationship between people like Imi and Imi's role and Imi's teams and the councillors, it feels like a real kind of nice reciprocal parallel relationship that kind of enables both sides of that to make the most of the opportunities. I wonder how you kind of experience that, and what your kind of reflections on that kind of councillors as community conveners has been.
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly everything you've heard so far is that the community council model is absolutely at the heart of how, you know, we at Test Valley operate. The community engagement officers are a huge part of being able to do what it is that we do. I mean, they are very much our eyes and our ears on the ground day after day, helping communities, helping volunteers to get things done, but also just making sure that all of those networks, or all those individuals, or all those groups are networked together in the right way. And I think, you know, some of the good examples of that are things like we run a regular resilience forum. So particularly in my part of the world, where we've got sort of small communities, we recognize that if there is a regional or national emergency, some of our smaller communities will be, just by definition, further down the pecking order in terms of blue light priorities. So making sure that these smaller communities can be resilient. So every three times a year, we bring them together, we convene them together, we share best practice. And that's just one example. Others are things like the community shop network. Again, community shops, absolutely vital to our rural communities. But again, if we can bring them together, share best practice, everyone can help out, because all of our community shops are struggling. I guess some of the other things which are really key is that whole convening role. And I think as community councillors, we are fairly unique in having that democratic mandate to bring groups together. Now, if it's sort of community groups in a particular area, you know, that can be often quite straightforward. Where it gets more challenging is when you've got really difficult issues that maybe cross a number of different sort of stakeholder groups. So, for example, if you had an issue where you've got antisocial behaviour and you've got planning enforcement breaches and you've got maybe a sort of a vulnerability issue, and you're trying to bring together the NHS and the police and the different parts of different councils, that can be really, really tough for the residents on their own. But as a community councillor, I think you are better placed and able to bring them together. I guess one of the other thoughts I had was around the community councillor role. It's really in part about helping the communities to articulate and evidence their needs and their wants, which are not always really well understood. And I think Andover Vision is a very good example of that. But on the other side, it's also about being the communication channel to inform residents about what's going on from a council standpoint, whether that's changes to planning or whether that's changes to local government reorganisation. I think maybe finally, the two other points just to touch on. The community councillor grant. I mean, I've never worked in another council before, but I understand it's reasonably unusual that backbench councillors each have a dedicated pot of money, not huge, but nonetheless an important pot of money that they can make sure is distributed for important community projects in their ward. And then just finally, because I know I've been rabbiting on a bit, is around training. And so I think Test Valley take a really thorough approach to training. It's not just for new councillors on day one learning the ropes, but it's an ongoing and active programme of training. And one of the things which I really like is it's diverse. It ranges all the way through from, dare I say it, fairly dry PowerPoint presentations about, planning regulations on the one hand, but all the way through to a councillor marketplace. So effectively, all of the different departments within the council have a stall in a big meeting, in a big sort of hall, and the councillors can come round and really engage on a direct basis with each of the individual departments. And there are services and departments within the council that no one would know they were there, but gives you the opportunity to really understand what we can do and therefore what we can do for our residents. So it's fantastic.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, we heard about that kind of the councillor induction as a sort of moment to really bring this convening role to life. And you think about the context of LGR, all these new people who are about to be elected to new institutions, new organisations. How do you set that up well from the start to understand what that role is, what that looks like? And I think how the council and the members and as Phil said, all members are there to work together to enable that in local communities. Feels really interesting. Kate, I'll kind of come to you to tell us perhaps a little about, as Andy said, this isn't just about the council. This is something that goes kind of much bigger, much wider, and that sense of investing in relationships, investing in the capacity to build collaborative working across a place, and maybe, I don't know, the sense of patience that it takes to do that, or the ability for those relationships to happen over time. Any reflections on that you'd share and what that's felt like in practice?
Yes, I'm ready to go. I've been scribbling notes and they align perfectly with that question. So that's, I don't know, serendipitous, but I think that people have mentioned the Andover Vision before, but that forum that consistently convenes stakeholders in Andover to hear from each other and hear wider contexts, and it's been really valuable. And the council's approach in being that consistent convener and curating the forum in a way that allows for different voices to feel that they have got equal right to be there and equal value in their presence has been really, really valuable. In terms of the sort of wider impact, there's a couple of examples I would give. Because of and that's taken years, I would say, in terms of Andover Vision and investment in that to see some of the fantastic fruits of that labour now. But because of the knowledge that we got from Andover as a primary care network, that way of working and starting to do some good partnership working with, for example, our leisure centre and the council, and delivering projects in partnership was quite novel. And our integrated care board, so Hampshire and Isle of Wight, sort of got wind of what we were doing and doing something different. And because of that, we have become sort of trusted deliverers of new things. So we were approached as one of only 2 sites in Hampshire to receive a significant pot of funding, which was sort of levelling up after COVID, because they knew that we had the connections with our communities through our partnership working to be able to actually have meaningful impact with that funds, and we were trusted with that. So I think, as Andy was alluding to, this can sound airy-fairy, but actually when you start to demonstrate what you can deliver, people get behind it, and sharp pointy things come. And then a second example, I think, was again, we were approached when one of our partners in public health became aware of a programme around leading for systems change in cardiovascular outcomes, and knowing that the breadth and strengths of our partnership working for Andover suggested that we apply. And when I reflect on, so there were 1 site per place in Hampshire, so that's 1 for Portsmouth, 1 for the Isle of Wight, 1 for Hampshire, but we actually managed to stretch them to 2 for Hampshire. So Portsmouth were like a national accelerator, and they were always going to get a place, but because we applied as Andover and our track record, they gave us an extra spot on this programme. When I reflect on what our team brings, so I sent an email out at short notice to our partners, and because of the strength and history of our relationships, we're able to get a really broad and strong team, ranging from the acute trusts, public health, VCSE sector, the council, primary care, all of that. There's people of influence and have leverage within their respective organisations, are interested in coming to the table to work together around that project. And there are other teams represented where they haven't got anybody outside of primary care, and that feels odd to me because I've now got used to this way of working, where I wouldn't think of going, oh, well, I want to do this project, I'm just going to get on and do it from a primary care without talking to any other party that's got a vested interest. And then one of the strengths, I think, of working on those partnerships and embedding that in resident voice is that if I meet resistance from one organisation or another, and I think that what we're trying to do meets an articulated resident need, I don't feel like I'm going to do that battle on my own. I feel like I can turn to my colleagues, at the council or elsewhere and say, Ashley, can you help me challenge on this resistance that I'm meeting here? So that emboldens me to do more.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely a sense of this kind of accumulation of capacity and ability and confidence to do more from both, from communities and from professionals, through that kind of solidarity of being in this together, and from the confidence, as you say, that comes from sort of knowing that you can be sure about the track you're on. You're not kind of guessing or pulling from nowhere as to what you're doing. You've got a kind of really clear anchor in the sense of what the community wants and needs, and when that's your kind of guide, it's easy to hold firm to that. So yeah, thank you, Kate, that's been great. We're going to come to some questions from the chat in just a moment, so please do, if you haven't already, pop some in there, but maybe just a final sentence or two from each of our panel members about what's next. Where does this work go from here? What are your hopes for the future? What are the opportunities or challenges that you see, and how do you hope to meet them from the work that you've been doing so far? Maybe we'll go in sort of reverse order there. Kate, should we come back to you first?
Sure. So I guess this work nests very well with the aspirations at national level for neighbourhood, and what it's allowing us to do is to be front and centre for opportunities to say, okay, can you test this thing out? at a, you know, we want to roll something out across Hampshire. We're going to give you resources to try this out for us because we know that you're most likely to work it out properly, and that gives us a position of influence to ask for what we want and need for our community as well.
Wonderful, thanks, Kate. Stuart, how about for you?
Sorry, I had technical issues there. Would you mind just sort of repeating? Sorry.
Just thinking about what's next, your kind of hopes for the future and opportunities, challenges that you see in just a sentence or two.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the key initiatives that I have in my portfolio is a community delivery fund. So this is really about supporting our rural communities. It's a new type of grant. It's not just about provision of capital, but it's also about providing all of the officer resource and other support that local communities need, often small communities, to deliver really impactful projects. So that's a key focus for us.
And there's more about that in the report, and I think a really interesting one, as you say, that wraparound support, but also the process for getting hold of that funding is really different to a sort of traditional process that I think's worth a look at for people. Imi, how about for you? What's next? What are your hopes?
I think for me, it's to continue to build on this really strong foundation that we have and think about, particularly as we move forward into local government reorganisation, how we enable these communities to become or continue to be really sustainable, and how that links to that kind of preventative approach at a real neighbourhood level. I think the word place gets thrown around so much, but really connecting it to those localities and the people that know their communities best.
Thanks, Imi. And Andy, before we come to any questions from the floor, what are your hopes? Where are you seeing this going?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I mean, one of the things is that I've worked now for an organisation that its use of resources, and I'm talking about multi-million pound use of resources and vast swathes of officer time, has been driven by communities. The idea of going back into an officer-led organisation where the resources are kept secretly and guarded fills me with horror. I just want to give a big shout out to the first piece of work you did in our system. The bigger you go, the less you know, and that became a place-based Bible for me. And we put that as part of our LGR submission to government, which was approved, as you know, in our geography. A lot of our aspirations are in that document about how we can move towards relational place-based services. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here, and Kate referred to the work around, I guess, alluding to the 10-year health plan, neighbourhood in health terms. But in terms of our overall agenda, public service reform is huge. There'll be some really big decisions made, Ellen, in the next few months, years, around who leads these systems. And if we end up with new public management type leadership, I think the opportunity is going to be lost. So we want brave politicians making brave decisions about how we make that left shift to prevention. And that isn't going to be done through traditional leadership. It's going to require all of the systems leadership skills we can have. So my hope is that we end up with fabulous new leaders in this system from all of the different organisations that we work with and the communities, and we can look forward to a much brighter future.
Thanks, Andy. And Dawn's just popped a link there into the chat for that other report that we did that you just mentioned. The bigger you go, the less you know, looking at, the kind of wider context of local government reorganisation and the opportunity there. Dawn, I know you've been keeping an eye on the chat. Are there a couple of questions you could put to our panel?
Yeah, so the first one, which lots of people I talk to about this work always want to know, is how does decision making actually work in your model? So particularly when aims are contested between different local groups, who actually makes the decisions when you can't get to the consensus? And also, how do you manage scarce resources across Test Valley within local places? So Stuart, can I come to you first, then maybe Imi pick up from your perspective as well?
I think it's a really good question, and I think someone mentioned it earlier. What we're really keen to avoid is the situation where those that shout the loudest dictate the terms of what happens in their communities. And so we put huge amounts of effort into sort of community engagement and genuinely understanding from a broad range of stakeholders what it is that they think about individual sort of proposals. At the same time, certainly in this community delivery fund, we're very mindful that, if the local community shop have got an idea and they want to run with it, they are the people that know their community shop better than anyone else. And if it's, hanging by a thread and it needs to be more sustainable, they are probably the people that have the best view around how to improve things, make them more sustainable. So it's a really tough balancing act, and there is no one size fits all answer. I'm afraid to say, you just need to sort of use your judgment, and it's all got to be evidence led.
Thanks, Stu. Emmy, do you want to kind of share from your perspective, because you're often always out there on the ground hearing different views? What's your role in helping to reach decisions ultimately from when you hear lots of different perspectives?
I think, building on what Stuart has said, it's about making sure that we are hearing from all of the community and being really inventive about how we try and do that. So making sure that we're not just turning up with a clipboard and looking like that person on the high street that no one wants to talk to. You are really embedding yourself within the community to have the right conversations with as broad a group of people as you can. And what I'd also say is that on the resources piece, it's about, I think it's important not to shy away from the difficult conversations. And I think that what we do really well as a council is try and facilitate productive conversations between all kinds of partners. And I think we all recognise the role that we play in trying to bring together those people to have collaborative conversations that are rooted in some honesty, but also in how we can share resources. I think it is so easy to look at things through a single mindset of how something's always been done. But I think what we're really seeing, especially in Andover at the moment, is that sharing of resources and assets between partners and across partners, and them seeing that kind of the mutual benefit from that as well. So it's not always that kind of binary choice. It's about that, looking for those additional extra opportunities as well. And that's where we really try and facilitate that conversation.
Thanks, Amy. So yeah, really important to have those honest and difficult conversations and be really honest about the trade-off. So we are just deciding between really difficult things. How do we share those honestly with partners, with communities?
I think sorry, Dawn, just jump in. The other thing that I noticed in doing the research is the ability of this work and this way of working to leverage more resource. So as kind of Kate, I think, was alluding to, but in some of these big regeneration projects, in some of these spaces, by being able to show that people are invested and on the same page with something, and that this is a response, that is a pretty powerful lever in opening up more resource or different resource from other places that maybe wouldn't be so accessible. And it seems like a lot of the energy is focused on how do we come together to leverage the bigger prize rather than fighting over the smaller prize or competing for smaller pots when we can do something bigger together. And the other thing that I was really strongly reminded of was that sense of, when it comes to contentious decisions or managing different perspectives, one thing that people spoke about was that idea of the kind of deliberative processes, the participative processes, where you're not just kind of asking people what they think, taking away lots of viewpoints and looking at them behind the scenes, but you bring that process into the open, you bring the evidence sharing into the open, and that once people have the collection of evidence together, actually it's not necessarily so contentious or so difficult to reach a shared understanding or a shared viewpoint. But it felt like there was a real kind of power shift in some of that, from it kind of being the council's job to collect different views, mediate between them, and make a decision kind of behind closed doors, to bringing that process out into something that many people and voices participate in. And then although the formal decision might be made about the funding or about the regen project in a committee meeting, still that's informed by this much longer train of input and voices and collective decision making, that again gives members the confidence to stand up and say, well, this loud group maybe don't like this thing, but actually I know there's a much broader base of support for this thing, so I can confidently act upon it. So something about how those different processes interplay into each other, even if the formal decision happens in quite a traditional way, it's what's gone on around that and beyond that makes a big part of the difference, I think. We've probably got time for one or two more questions if there are some more, Dawn.
Yeah, so there was an interesting question about the approach you've outlined, kind of reflecting the shift of collaboration being goodwill to collaboration being durable civic capacity. And I think that's really reflected in the conditions you've built and how it's not just a choice for people to collaborate if they want to, if they have enough time, if you have a resource. Collaboration is the default, it's the way you work. So one question is, how are you making collaboration the default, the durable civic capacity at all levels of the system? And there's also been a few questions about systems leadership, about moving away from hierarchical approaches, how everyone feels empowered to act and contribute. So I'll kind of leave those and pick whichever one you choose. How do we really hardwire collaboration, and how do we really embed systems leadership and make people feel empowered to act? Kate, can I come to you first? Pick whichever you'd like, or both.
So I think embedding it is something that we're working out, and I guess that's things we're conscious of, that at the moment this way of working has been in place. We have had some changes of key leadership, so I took over. My predecessor was very, had built a lot of the foundation work for where we've got to now, but there are things to be thought about in terms of how we might choose to write certain bits of documentation around our organisation. Well, what our ethos, what our vision, what our mission statements are, and there are things that we have done practically in some of the work that we've undertaken. For example, with our health hub that's based in the shopping centre in Andover, part of that in terms of writing into the purpose of that building is that it's about prevention and health promotion, and so that helps kind of prevent drift from its intended purpose in what the community have said and what our partners feel we are kind of galvanized around. So having things like that in place, and the council have been pivotal in holding different partners to account on that measure where there's been stretch at certain points for there maybe to be a shift or a drift away from that. So I think there is will, but there's more to be done in making what's working well with named individuals within organisations, embedded within organisations to a level that there's a legacy that will live beyond the people that are in the room right now.
Thanks, Kate. That's really interesting. So I think Phil mentioned, despite the 15 years, despite how much buy-in there is from partners, it can feel fragile a lot of times. And I think it's really interesting. You've talked about relationships, peer accountability, but then there's also the formal things like what is the remit for a building and how do we have those concrete things to hold each other to accountable on. So thanks for sharing that. Imi, how about you? You're working directly with communities. From what I've seen, it seems like you and your team are really empowered to go out and have the conversations you think are needed to really play that convening and systems leadership role. So what does that look like in practice for you? And what does it look like for communities? How do you help communities feel empowered to make decisions and participate?
I think the key thing for me, and it goes back to that, how do you make collaboration the default, is that we really try and invest in relationships. It's not coming to the table with an agenda or with a problem that we think needs fixing. Actually, we're trying to sit down with our communities, invest in those relationships and really understand what the challenges are, and when they arise, who trusts each other, who knows each other, where do we need to build those bridges or the connections and the gaps, rather than just looking to solve the issue. And so I think for me, it really starts with the investment that is in partnerships like Andover Vision, Romsey Future, the informal groups that get together within our communities. It's about recognising those and the strengths that's there, and trying to, in terms of engagement and the engagement officers, giving support to enable those things. And I think that kind of really builds this really positive two-way dialogue between us and communities. It's not us going out seeking to solve a problem or looking for something, looking for questions. It's really listening to understand and bringing with us colleagues from across the organisation as well. It's not just community engagement officers on the front line having these conversations. We work so collaboratively with colleagues from all over the council to make sure that we're not, you know, it's not this closed organisation. We want to have these conversations and kind of move things forward really proactively.
Thanks. So yeah, I love that idea of you're building the collaborative capacity even before it's needed almost,
Yeah,
so that everyone is
exactly.
able to be both proactive and solve problems as they arise. Thanks for sharing that. Stuart, how about you? How do we make collaboration the default, and how are you empowered as a systems leader in your councillor role?
Yeah, I mean, the flippant answer is that it's Imi and her team that keep me on the straight and narrow. But I think the real answer is that particularly in rural communities, which is where I spend a lot of my time, it's you realise how important one or two or three individuals in each of those communities is to just getting things done. And so you know, there's that vulnerability piece again around all of that, because it's literally two or three critical people that are the sort of spearheads and the deliverers of the project. So you just sort of need to, it's the right thing to do, but you just need to do it in order to make sure these projects are successful. And I think, you know, in the world of social media, it's so easy for the general public to criticize some of the stuff that you're doing. And the way that you really have the confidence that what you're doing is the right thing is because you do have that huge evidence base and all of that collaborative work that's been done. And that applies not just to rural communities, but the bigger projects in Andover and Romsey as well.
Thanks, Stuart. And yeah, that confidence in are we doing the right thing feels so important, whatever our roles. So yeah, really great to hear how that is for all of you, really embedded in the voice of residents. Andy, coming to you finally, what's the final reflection you want to share, picking up on some of the questions that have come through?
Yeah, I guess that new public management thing I talked about, it seems to be an obsession with control and risk. And I think if you look at it through that perspective, you start to understand actually by not being open, by not being collaborative, actually we're missing a whole lot of opportunities. And if we're really going to change the way we work, we've got to accept that system has failed us. So I think that the risk is by not becoming open and collaborative. And so if you want to kind of look at some of the examples, for me, it's around, in our case, directors working in place-based geographical locations with community projects without their hierarchical power, without the ability to be able to control things, because that's when you start to see better behaviours develop. And for me, that is at the heart of where we need to go as leaders, whatever you want to call it, systems leadership, adaptive leadership. It is about people behaving in a way that generates great collaboration. And for all of the reasons we've heard today, that will lead to better results. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Great note to end on. Ellen, was there anything you wanted to say to close before we?
Only that I really encourage people to have a look at the report. It's rich with many more examples and some of the practicalities are there and stories, and I'm sure the team would be happy to tell you more about them. Thank you so much, Stuart, Andy, Imi, Kate. It's been really great to have you with us. So thanks so much for your contributions. There's still more in the chat, I'm sure, to respond to. So yeah, I know you're sticking around, get involved in those conversations. And I'll pass back over to you, Dawn. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. You really brought that to life in practice and from so many different perspectives. But now we're actually going to move beyond Test Valley, and the work in Test Valley, it's really rich, got long-standing history. We've heard really strong evidence about how powerful it is in terms of impact for local people. But one of the key messages from Test Valley themselves are this work has to be context-led. So what we want to do now is to look at some work beyond Test Valley and think about what's relevant from Test Valley's approach. We think those conditions are broadly relevant, but also how does neighbourhood governance show up? How does it need to look different in different places with different histories, demographics, assets, challenges? So I'm really pleased to be joined by a brilliant panel to help us learn from examples of neighbourhood governance in different places and to reflect on the opportunity at a national level as well. Wherever we start with this work, whether it's with the council, whether it's with the community, whether you're in national government trying to make this work, it takes all of us if it's going to be impactful. So first we're going to hear from Ed Wallace, Director of Policy and Engagement at Locality. Ed's going to talk, we've heard from Test Valley about an approach that kind of started with the council, building on all of the great community assets that exist. Ed's going to talk a bit about some examples that start from a more community-led place, sharing some insights from across Locality's work and some specific initiatives they're involved in relevant to neighbourhood governance. We'll then hear from Maddie, Director of Vibrant Walsall CIC, and also involved as a community leader in We're Right Here. She's going to share some of her work setting up a resident-led initiative to really shape decisions in her place. We'll then hear from Carrie and Jampol, who work in Ealing, Carrie at the council as Assistant Director of Connected Communities, and Jampol as Director of Southall Community Alliance. They will reflect on how they're working alongside each other as part of the Your Voice, Your Town initiative to really embed diverse community voice in their approach to neighbourhood governance. And then finally, we'll hear from Lucy, Director of Research and Participation at Demos, about the national policy context, her sense of the opportunities, and also some of Demos's upcoming work, very relevant to this agenda, which you're all invited to be part of. So Ed, I'll start with you. What reflections would you like to share based on what you've heard and based on insights from your work at Locality?
Brilliant. Well, yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. And it was like fantastic to hear more about the Test Valley work, because I think it really chimes with the things that we've been doing at Locality. So we're the national membership network for local community organisations. We've got about 2,000 members across the country, all doing different things to support their neighbourhoods. And we really started thinking about neighbourhood governance a few years ago, where we ran a commission on the future of localism, which was looking back at the Localism Act, back for the coalition era, and the devolution that had kind of followed from there. And one of the key insights from that was that if we really want power to go onwards into neighbourhoods, then you need to have something at that neighbourhood level to make it stick. Otherwise, it's going to stay in those kind of regional authorities or local authorities. But then the really important thing that we talked about, which I think really chimes with the Test Valley work, is that's not going to be a one-size-fits-all institution. I mean, kind of many people's answer to the question of neighbourhood governance is to have more parish councils kind of everywhere. And there are parish councils can work really well kind of in some places, but in other places they don't work so well, and they're not going to be a solution for every community, particularly where there isn't that kind of culture in more kind of urban neighbourhoods. So what our kind of approach has very much been, then you can't impose a particular institution. You've got to try and build on the energy, the capacity that exists in communities, and kind of start from there. And so we see across the Locality membership lots of community anchor organisations who are already there in neighbourhoods doing a lot of the things that we might want kind of good neighbourhood governance institutions to do. So with a bit more kind of backing, a bit more support, then they could kind of perform the role really well. Obviously, they don't exist everywhere, and in other areas we can see kind of newer alliances of different types of community groups coming together to try and provide some of those types of solutions for neighbourhoods. So yeah, it really needs to be a flexible approach, I think. And so that's something that we've been developing through the We're Right Here campaign that you've already mentioned, and we're going to be hearing from Maddie. But that campaign is a coalition of a few different national organisations, but it's led by community leaders, and has been really pushing for that national legislative change. And we're really pleased that there has been some progress in the English Devolution and Community Empowerment kind of bill on this. But the kind of the model that we've been suggesting is something that we call a community covenant, which is a flexible power sharing agreement that tries to kind of bring together local authorities and the local community in a way that reflects what that community kind of really looks like. So it's really about that partnership, I think, is really important. You know, quite often these things are pursued in isolation, which can only ever go so far. So we really need to build that partnership. But I think kind of something that Andy said, which really resonated with our work, was about kind of bringing together the representative democracy and participatory democracy, really trying to bring the best of those two forms of democracy together in a powerful way. So it does feel like there's an important moment for pushing for the right legislation to enable that. And so we're right here, we've developed 6 principles for community-powered neighbourhood governance, which I won't go through now, but I will kind of link to the report for that in the chat so people can have a look at those principles. And those are really framing how we're trying to campaign at the moment around this. But I think just to finish, you know, legislation would really help, and we kind of need to get that right, but also we don't need kind of government to tell us kind of what to do here before we can set these things up. So, you know, we've heard loads about it in Test Valley. There's another example that we're right here supporting in Shropshire, where they've developed one of these power sharing agreements, community covenants already in Market Drayton, and that's, you know, starting to have some real impact. So let's kind of push hard at this political moment, but also let's not wait for that to happen. There's lots that local areas can do to put powerful community-led neighbourhood governance arrangements in place.
Thanks, Ed. Powerful call to action, and please do share the covenant, the principles in the chat. I'm sure everyone would love to see those. Maddie, we'll come to you next. Would you like to share a little bit about We're Right Here, your work with Vibrant Walsall, and what does it look like to approach neighbourhood governance from a resident-led approach, and also how do you work with councils and other public bodies in that?
Okay. Right, where do I start? I'm Maddie. I am a director of Vibrant Walsall. We're in North Notts. I live here, and we formed Vibrant Walsall 12 years ago because we care about our community, and we're open to everyone in our community who needs support. And our approach really is about working with individuals and organisations who are already here to support them and for us to work together. We became and we'd see ourselves as a community anchor organisation. We got involved with the We're Right Here campaign because whilst we know that the work that we're doing here is very powerful locally, experience has taught us that there is power in communities, but we need to model it, we need to embody it, and we need to be proactive in holding space for positive collaboration in the community. We also know that through working with the We're Right Here campaign, that there are other anchor organisations across the country who we're right here, we're doing it right now, and we can all work better together. And as residents, we all have that lived experience. So I think it was Imogen was saying, you know, the community officers working with residents day in, day out, you know, I was quite inspired by that, and it's really nice to hear that. And I wonder how many of the community officers are actually working in the area that they live, which I think could just be so much more powerful. If we talk about neighbourhood governance here, we have formal neighbourhood governance. We've got a parish council, district council. They don't really operate in the community-powered way that you know, we'd like to see through the We're Right Here campaign. However, we have seen the strength of how community-powered partnerships can work. I've got my little badge on here if anybody can see, our Small Steps to Feeling Great partnership that we have formed over the last 3 or 4 years with our district council, Active Knots, our primary care network, our schools, our local CVS, and we've come together, and through coming together, we've landed a new £9.1 million health hub locally. That came in with funding from Sport England and with a commitment from the council after hearing the voice of residents. So we spoke to residents, Vibrant led that work with support from the local council, with significant funding from the local council to make that happen. And when we talk about hearing Test Valley saying, you know, talking about moving forward and how do we keep this embedded, we were very lucky because it's individuals within our district council who saw the value here and supported us and gave us an equal voice around the table for one project. After that one project, they're now working with us and to help, you know, to help continue this work. But it's a small aspect of the council. We're not, you know, across every aspect of what's happening in our community, but we are focusing on health and well-being, and that's pretty broad. So I think from an impact really on community neighbourhood governance, the best thing for me about this way of working is that we've had to go in the room and focus on what's important for residents. So egos out the door, cards on the table, you know, be honest and open about your restrictions. And, you know, we know councils have regulations and ways of working, but they also have to appreciate that resident organisations can be much more flexible and much more effective. But we need something such as a community covenant that would help keep that equal voice around the table for residents. Because if it's not, you know, so if it's not backed up with legislation, also from a resident-led organisation point of view, we can only be here as long as we are funded, and we are constantly applying for funding. And organisations like ours across the country, if you want to make the best of their voices and you want to turn communities around, you have to invest in them, and it has to be long-term investment. And the social impact value of investing in those organisations will be phenomenal.
Thanks so much, Maddie. I mean, you've made a really powerful case, echoing a lot of what we've heard about Test Valley, about, you know, if you've got a strong partnership rooted in community voice, you can achieve a lot and potentially make the case for investment, and hopefully make sure you increasingly get a seat around the table and that equal voice more and more in the future. Thanks so much for sharing that, Maddie. And next I'll come to you, Carrie and Jan Paul. It'd be great to hear your reflections. You've heard from Test Valley, you've heard from Warsop. What's your work in Ealing looking like? What's common? What's different?
Yeah, fantastic. It's been great to hear about those examples, and we're very lucky that we've been able to learn and bring inspiration from lots of places around the country, and if anything, shamelessly steal from some of these great ideas, which I think is always helpful. So the Ealing context is slightly different. You know, when we're a very different place in London, we've got about 370,000 residents, 160 language spoken, over 50% of the population was born abroad, so really different experiences that are bringing different folks to the table, but lots of what we're hearing from across the panels really resonate with me, in that there's lots of commonality, in that what we're trying to do in Ealing is really embed this ecosystem approach. So we're going to talk a little bit about Your Voice, Your Town, just to share how that's coming alive, but actually it's about rewiring, thinking about our mindsets, behaviours, ways of working internal, how we can flex our collaborative muscle together, how we can shift resources, how we can think of power and relationships in quite different ways across everything we're doing, and how we really strengthen the assets, the community anchors, and some of what we've been hearing today. But we did have, in the sense, we had a neighbourhood governance model. It was a ward forum model across different parts of the borough, but it probably wasn't working, and we definitely weren't hearing from different voices. They tended to be the same voices, and what we were doing is getting stuck in these kinds of rhythms of kind of projects would be put forward, but and we've been lucky that we've always had resources to be able to put to those structures, but it wasn't necessarily enabling that progression that we were hoping and that shift of power and relationships. So we spent some time working with lots of community organisations like Jan Pals, but lots of others across the whole of Ealing, and listening to residents where they were and thinking about what might work better in the future. And they really wanted us to do things like get the basics right, but have a different way of working on this. And what we've come up with is a model to help structure this, to kind of build our collaborative muscles together, which is called Your Voice, Your Town. And we've got 7 towns in Ealing, so they all need to be tailored quite different. But on the towns, part of the town team, town structure is, in each of our towns, we've got a town team, and that is made up of a variety of community organisations, faith organisations, businesses, residents, and that's open to lots of different folks. But the idea is that the town team work together and we look at where we can create action together. The council in this is a facilitator, an enabler, and we also give them budget to make change happen. And that can be based on the priorities that we've worked with lots of different voices across our communities to hear about what matters locally. And the idea over the last year is we've been flexing that collaborative muscle and learning how to do things differently. So Jan Powell, I don't know whether you want to come in and share a little bit about your experience.
Thanks, Carrie. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Jan Powell Bazran, and I work for a charity called Southall Community Alliance. Can I just go back to the geography of it all? So Ealing is a borough in West London, and where I am is a town called Southall, which is one of the 7 towns in Ealing, and we're in the west of the borough, so right on the edge. Our 7 towns are very distinct, have different identities and communities. So I think most people would agree locally that our area, which is called Southall and is made up of 6 geographical areas or wards, is probably the most populous part of the borough, if you include the very large kind of undocumented community in the area, and that's quite significant locally. So Carrie's correct. So we had, up until the pandemic, a model of governance, which was based upon each area ward having 3 councillors, and the councillors would meet every quarter in front of their residents and have a conversation and so on and so on. And by and large, it was something which worked fairly well in nearly all areas of Ealing except ours. And we found a problem kind of emerging about 7 or 8 years ago, where we found that less and less people were attending ward forums in Southall. Some people were quite cynical. Some people felt that we were over consulted, and people looked at us like we were fish in a goldfish bowl, looking in at you, peering at you, prodding you, sort of trying to get the best out of you and so on. So I actually, when I was listening to Maddie a short while ago, I was actually thinking ditto. There's so much of what she said which kind of resonates with us in Southall. So we had a dysfunctional kind of system in Southall particularly, and probably in parts of Ealing. And I feel that in our area particularly, we had what I would call a democratic deficit. We had locally elected people who were not really responsive, or in some cases were almost bullied out of speaking at meetings by 1 or 2 kind of locally dissident and very, very loud voices. And we've moved away from that now over the last sort of 2 years to something new, a model which is based on a survey and consultation carried out last year, which Carrie mentioned, called Your Voice, Your Town, where each of the 7 towns was invited to put forward its own or their own priorities. And after a period of time, all of the many priorities were channeled and distilled into the one important one. And in our area, the one priority was something called the desire for having cleaner and more pleasant streets. how to make cleaner and more pleasant streets was left in the hands of a local team, which has been really well kind of put together, consisting of residents, community organisations, some councillors and others, and oddly enough, also engaging some of those who were most kind of vocal against Ealing Council and the previous kind of ward forum setup that we had. So rather than excluding the distant voices, welcome them, incorporate them in. Everyone has a perspective which can add to the discussion. And so I think we've got a model now which is working quite well. It's still early days. I think that there's a change in the way that the relationship between Ealing Council and local residents is evolving. I noticed somebody mentioned earlier that there's an obsession in some areas with control and risk. I think we're seeing that local obsession kind of slowly being eased. And I think that certainly, I think the way to go locally seems to be with decentralizing and devolution of control. And I think that the local model of town centre based teams is a really good model in an area which is extremely diverse and extremely riddled with pockets of high deprivation. So it's work in progress, but a good model. And I hope it's something that which could be replicated in other areas.
Thank you, Jampal. And this was just obviously one of the important things I think in the research is demonstrating this ecosystem approach, because this is actually in some regards a structure that has enabled a change and signaled a change, but that actually is only one way that we're having to back that up with lots of different ways, working with networks differently, using things like our reforms of children's agenda to really work in a different way locally, how we're designing how some of our staff will work in the future alongside NHS partners, etc., and really thinking about that systems leadership working in a different way. So there was lots that resonated with me, but we're definitely still on that journey with lots more to do. So lots to resonate, and really how we're making it more suitable for Ealing is quite interesting.
Thanks so much, Carrie, Jampal. Yeah, I love the references to flexing that collaborative muscle, and Jampal, you just brought to life so well what this looks like. And actually, it seems like you've come a long way in quite a short space of time in terms of really, you know, recognizing what wasn't working and starting to shift the power dynamics and the whole functions of the council. It sounds like, Carrie, as you start to think through the implications and move away from control to more devolved decisions. Thanks so much for sharing both. And finally, Lucy, I'll hand to you. You're looking at this from kind of a national policy perspective. What's going on? What gives you hope? What might be the challenges ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. I enjoyed reading the Collaborate paper so much and listening to all the contributions today. I'll just give a sort of a brief intro to Demos and how our work fits in, and then I've got some reflections broadly on the kind of the implications at the national level, and some thoughts for kind of what then is required of national government. But brief intro to Demos, if you have or haven't heard of us. We're a cross-party think tank, and our mission is upgrading democracy. So all our work at the moment is about reimagining the relationship between state and citizen, which is obviously at the heart of what we've been discussing today. And implicit in that reimagination of the relationship is also what I find particularly fascinating, a reimagination of what it means to be a citizen in the 21st century, what it means to be a public servant, what it means to be a leader. And Dawn, you mentioned the Neighbourhood Governance project that we're doing. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but we're very much kind of exploring neighbourhood governance with all those kind of questions, with that framing in mind. But first, yes, I've been asked to reflect on sort of what the Test Valley model means for sort of at the national level. So some general reflections, and then some pointers for national government and national policy. My starting point here is I think let us not underestimate how radical this is, the thing that we're talking about. It is rethinking and reimagining and behaving differently in a new political economy. And I think in all the ways that is true at the local level and in the relationship between local authorities and communities, that is also true for the rest of the system, how local government relates to central government. You know, the words that we've been using to describe the council's role: convening, facilitating, enabling, curating. Somebody used like that, supporting. They can't just describe how councils relate to communities. Those have to be words that can be used to describe relationships throughout the whole system. This is not something that can only kind of operate or work, be different at the local level. It is a culture shift, and that kind of mindset shift is that Collaborate have identified. Ellen, you kind of, when you were talking through I think it was a roadmap, or certainly kind of like the stages through, that's where the change needs to start, right? The culture shift, the mindset shift, and I think that is also the kind of the key challenge to this approach. One of the challenges to this approach spreading more widely. Not that there's resistance to the idea, because there's a lot of support behind it, but when you've been doing something in a particular way for so long, and the incentives are all built in a particular way, it can be really hard to start doing things differently. And I think the other thing that we've also been, a theme that I've heard is that there are gaps in capabilities, in skills, in confidence, to do things in a different way. There's a kind of certainly amongst communities where that civic muscle, let's say, has sort of been weakened or not had a chance to sort of be exercised and stretched. Certainly like in the past kind of 10 to 15 years, there's a sort of a need to relearn and rebuild some of those sort of fundamental skills. And then the other kind of just broad reflection I would have, which is that it's and the Collaborate paper does this brilliantly, but what the proposition here isn't easy to conceptualize. It isn't as easy to hold in your head as a neighbourhood area committee, where you can kind of draw a nice diagram, you can hand it to a delivery team, it can be rolled out, it can be scaled up. These types of ways of working that we're all used to, and what we see in Test Valley is that's not what it has been created. I think Councillor North said at the very start that they've created behaviours rather than structures. And of course, it's that makes it harder to see. It makes it harder to know if it's there or working well or not. And of course, it looked different in different places. I think there's a really interesting question there. I won't go into it now, looking at the time, but about whether actually that makes this approach more or less resilient. There is an argument that I think that actually institutions can be quite brittle and break quite easily, but that sort of deeper behavioural and cultural change can actually often be more resilient. But perhaps a debate for another day on that. So anyway, thoughts on what sort of central government needs to do, and I think I'd kind of point to 5 main things. Firstly, I think there's one of the key values sort of at that national level is crafting and communicating the narrative around this, making the case for why this matters, what it means for how we live our political and social lives, and what it means for service delivery. This isn't about central government mandating a particular way of doing things. This is about actually sort of persuading and winning hearts and minds, and I think that kind of that narrative, that vision piece is absolutely critical to that. And linked to that is a kind of the second point is around ensuring a structural coherence. So we want to build in flexibility, and we've talked about it not being a one size fits all model and so on, but that there has to be a sort of a clear logic and sort of a coherent a structural logic there, even where practice varies from place to place. So I think it's kind of getting that balance right between what is kind of the architecture of this and where there can be flexibility. Third, we've again discussion about sort of outcomes rather than structures, and I think then that really points to central government being in the best position to define those outcomes, to help build a measure of success. I know that there are measures of success out there, but sort of bringing again some sort of coherence in that, and then sort of related to that, ensuring an incentive structure around that so that the system rewards the right things, and not just sort of reverting to business as usual. Fourth, I think it's on national government to find different ways of spreading this type of approach. I use the phrases scaling up and rolling out in the quotation marks. That isn't the right language or the right approach for this. It's much more about inspiring, guiding, showcasing what's working, making the case for it, and supporting and guiding kind of once that interest is there. Fifth and final point, I think it was Andrew Ferrier who talked about evolution. That word kind of really resonated with me, and thinking about actually how it's been well over a decade Test Valley has been working in this way, that this is about sort of building change, building the ability to evolve and adapt over time into the plan. So it's not sort of like, from day one everyone will have this structure and this is how it's going to work from now on. It needs to be sort of more organic than that. So I think sort of thinking in stages, what's realistic for a foundational 3 to 5 year period, what's the framework to work within, and a mechanism like right to request from communities where responsibilities, budgets, remit can kind of grow organically over time as those capabilities and so on, and that capacity evolves at the hyperlocal level. And I think that's would also be an interesting way, or not interesting, sorry, useful way for central government to actually be able to identify places that are really thriving and doing well and can be kind of showcased, or their expertise kind of shared, compared to places that perhaps need more support to move in this way. So as my reflections and sort of 5 implications, or sort of the things that I think national government, MHCLG, maybe number 10 North need to sort of consider. Just a brief note then on the neighbourhood governance work that we're doing. So looking to sort of to fill in some of the gaps that exist, in the provision of the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill, and trying to sort of draw together all the ideas and sort of amazing examples of innovation that we see, and the one thing that is good about this project is that there is so much material and so many ideas and good thinking going on in this space, but I really want to make sure that our work is properly connected into the ecosystem. So I would invite please, anybody that would like to contribute to that project to get in touch. I'll put my email in the chat. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing around the country. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lucy. And Lucy will share her details. Please do get in touch. This is a brilliant opportunity to share more of these brilliant examples of practice. Lucy just shared some thoughts for national government, where to go from here. I'm going to really briefly come to our other panellists and just get your thoughts. There's lots of people on the call today who are thinking about how to get started, where they're perhaps earlier stages in the journey. I'd love to hear one quick top tip you have for people just getting started with this work. Ed, could I come to you first?
So I think there are lots of examples kind of out there. I think Lucy was right to highlight that there's some pretty big kind of behaviours that need to be kind of shifted in this, but there's a kind of real movement building. I think that is kind of showing what's possible, and there's lots of energy behind it. So I think kind of you know, there's lots of kind of inspiration out there, I would say. So kind of, you know, be part of these types of networks, you know, get involved with We're Right Here, talk to us at locality. You know, there's lots of things kind of out there which can provide some inspiration for getting started, I think.
Thanks, Ed. Maddie.
Well, our experience when we started, we got together, we invited 18 local groups who were doing work in the area, and you know, scouts, parish council, etc. Invited those groups together. We did a warts and all exercise. What's good, what's great, what do we can't even talk about that we know we might never have a chance for fixing, and what's amazing, and you know, and turn that into a report, and we started work together from there. So
great practical tip. Thanks, Maddie. How about you, Jan-Paul? How would you get started?
I think for me, it's a couple of things. Firstly, Ealing is a borough, and I think other areas may be different, but Ealing is a borough where we have a very distinct and strong voluntary sector. So if you have a community infrastructure in your area, please use it. There's so much knowledge, lived experience, understanding, and also solutions which will come through developing a relationship with your local voluntary and community sector. They are your community's voices. The second thing is I would urge politicians to be quite courageous, I think, in these situations. Sometimes it's kind of a step in the dark, taking a risk, trying something new, a different way of engagement, and sometimes it won't work, but you persist. And I think that's what's been our experience in Ealing. Ealing Council's been really good at engaging locally, and over time we found a way. You know, we've managed to find a way, and I think it's a way which will thrive locally. And then finally, I think the third part of the jigsaw for us is once you do actually engage, listen and act upon what you gather, because too often we are listened and, as I said, over consulted, and we don't get to hear back what the decisions are, the outcomes are, and people are left frustrated and kind of apathetic. So please act on what you hear. Thanks.
Thanks, Jan-Paul. Carrie, one top tip from you.
Yeah, I don't know whether Jan-Paul and I prepared, but no, we I would say the relationship. So build the relationships first, because everything else can follow. Listen, and then imagine. So I think sometimes we get stuck in what's here now, but we could imagine quite differently, and those alternatives can sometimes feel quite hard to imagine. But actually, having the space for imagination matters. And then, as Jan-Paul says, be bold and brave, because we're not going to do this work effectively if we can't do things differently.
And it's been so brilliant to hear the diverse range of views, but a lot of commonality and core themes, I think, across all of your views on what's working well and what's needed for the future. So thank you so much for being part of today's conversation. Really brought some richness and helped us reflect on Test Valley's experience in a wider context. So thank you, everyone. Before we close, I'm just going to hand back to Councillor Phil North for some closing remarks and thoughts from him.
Thanks, Dawn. I think it's been a fascinating discussion today, really, and obviously there's been various different approaches to neighbourhood governance. But for me, I think the enduring theme that's come through is it's not about those formal structures, it's about the culture, it's about the behaviours. And that for us in Test Valley, that is behaviours of both councillors and staff. Councillors focusing on the challenges in their area in a sort of mature and grown-up way. And you saw from the video with the leader of the opposition in Test Valley saying, and we've got this relationship where we know that we will have to oppose each other at certain periods of the time, and that's just politics. But we're grown up enough to understand that we get over that, and the areas where we can work together and do work together, which is the majority of the things that we do that in a place-based way. And then in staff behaviours as well, I think Andy referred to it, and he was talking about elected members being brave, but it's also about officers being brave as well. Reflected on not working in silos, but actually ensuring that when we do get into the new unitary authorities in the future in lots of parts of the country, that this leadership comes down from both elected members and officers in terms of that way of working, because there's not going to be a huge amount of money around in local government. There isn't now. There certainly won't be in the future. And it might look like, from some of the examples that we've given, that there's a lot of money that we just dish out. But that's not necessarily the case. That is trying to fund a more sort of preventative approach, working with communities, enabling communities to fly by priming some projects and then getting them to do more things for themselves. And you just got to create the space for doing that. And I was struck with what Paul was saying in terms of from Ealing there. And we had the exact same experience in Test Valley, where there were potentially negative voices at the beginning. But once you start doing those citizens' assemblies, creating those networks or space for different opinions, then some of those voices are more calm, and they actually become your greatest advocates because they recognise that strength of the network and working together and leaving their organisational baggage at the door. So I suppose when you were finishing there in terms of top tips, my tip would be to just get on with it. We had a session in Test Valley yesterday as a national thing called Test, Learn and Grow, and the big message coming across from that yesterday was actually just be brave, get out there, make some decisions, create the space for those networks, build those relationships, and you will get a lot out of it. And the best time to start is today, essentially.
Thanks so much, Phil, and for co-hosting the event with us. Brilliant note to end on. And as Lucy said, this is radical, but we've seen today it is possible if you start with what's already strong, really invest in those relationships, those conditions, don't default to structures. And we've seen the benefits in terms of democratic renewal, more responsive local services, more connected and self-sufficient communities as well. So I hope everyone who joined us today has taken some inspiration from everything you've heard. Do get in touch with Lucy to be part of Demos's work. And as you leave, we've got a final question to pose for you on Slido, if you can spare a few moments. So our question is, what's your takeaway and or what's your hope as you leave the session? I think Grace is just going to put that up on the screen. If you pop onto Slido, what's your key takeaway and what's your hope? And we'll follow up from today to share the recording, to share the slides, the report, Lucy's details, so you can get in touch about Demos's work, and also details of all of our speakers if you'd like to continue the conversation. Just as this is about collaboration at the local level, it's also about collaboration between all of us to build that national movement, as Ed spoke about. So please do share your thoughts as you leave, and thanks so much everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.